There are television shows that don't just entertain, they define who a nation thinks it is. In 1981, when Only Fools and Horses first aired on BBC One, Britain was changing fast. Council flats stood like concrete forests, dreams were rationed to paychecks, and laughter was the cheapest form of escape. Into that world walked a man with slick hair, a sheepskin coat, and more confidence than cash. His name was Derek Del Boy Trotter, and his swagger would become part of British DNA. But Del Boy wasn't just a character. He was a mirror held up to everyone who'd ever said, "Next year we'll be millionaires." And the man who brought him to life, David Jason, wasn't the overnight sensation people think he was. David Jason came from humble beginnings himself. Before he ever tasted fame, he worked as an electrician. There was no family dynasty, no shortcut into show business. When he auditioned for Only Fools and Horses, the producers saw something rare, the ability to make tragedy funny and failure beautiful. That balance between charm and desperation became the soul of Del Boy. Jason didn't just play a salesman, he sold hope to an entire country. As the series gained traction, Jason crafted every line with obsessive care. His now iconic fall through the open bar, it wasn't a blooper, it was rehearsal, calculation, artistry. The timing, the pause before collapse, the smooth recovery, it became television perfection. Yet behind that comedic genius was a man quietly terrified of letting people down. He studied Charlie Chaplin, observed human behavior on buses and in markets, trying to capture that blend of dignity and defeat that made Del Boy real. The fame that followed was suffocating. People shouted catchphrases at him in supermarkets. Journalists hounded his private life. He once admitted that fame felt like wearing Del Boy's coat, even when it was boiling outside. For decades, he carried that weight, the smiling everyman who could never truly step off stage. What few know is how deeply Jason internalized the optimism of Del Boy. He took care of his colleagues like family. When co-stars struggled, he was there, humble, protective, endlessly loyal. And that loyalty turned him from actor to legend. But with success came solitude. Jason later revealed that when filming stopped, he'd sit alone, still hearing Del's voice echoing in his mind. The line, "He who dares wins," became less a joke and more a personal mantra, a reminder that confidence, even when faked, could change fate. Maybe that's why audiences never let go of him, because deep down, every viewer saw a bit of themselves in Del Boy. The hustler, the dreamer, the survivor. Decades later, Jason remains the face of British comedy, but the truth, the man behind the laughs, is gentler, lonelier, more human than anyone imagined. And as time marched on, the golden duo that kept him grounded began to drift apart. Every legend needs its contrast. For every storm, a silence. For every Del Boy, a Rodney. When Only Fools and Horses hit British television in 1981, audiences laughed at the absurdity of two brothers fumbling through get-rich-quick schemes in the shadow of Thatcher's Britain. But under all that laughter lived something tender, an unspoken story of vulnerability. That heartbeat came from one man, Nicholas Lyndhurst, the actor who made awkwardness poetic and failure strangely comforting. He was never meant to be the star, yet somehow he became the conscience of the show. Nicholas Lyndhurst wasn't the typical comedian. Soft-spoken, shy, almost withdrawn, he carried a natural stillness that television rarely rewards. But when paired with David Jason's blazing charisma, that stillness became power. As Rodney Trotter, Lyndhurst embodied the dreamer who believed the world owed him something, even though it never did. He was book-smart but street-blind, idealistic yet insecure. And every time Del called him "you plonker," the insult landed with affection Britain could feel through the screen. What audiences didn't see was how eerily similar Lyndhurst was to Rodney in real life. Fame unsettled him. While his co-stars soaked in applause, he retreated inward, preferring quiet nights at home to after-show parties. He once admitted that being recognized in public made him anxious. He couldn't reconcile being loved by millions with being just Nick, a husband, a father, a man who wanted normalcy. As the seasons rolled on, Rodney's growth mirrored Lyndhurst's own maturing presence. Gone was the naive teenager. In his place stood a man carrying life's bruises. When Rodney finally found love, struggled with fatherhood, and faced disappointment after disappointment, Lyndhurst infused those scenes with raw honesty. There was no exaggeration, no performance, just lived emotion. It's what made audiences root for him, not as a clown, but as a human being stumbling through existence. Yet success has a cruel way of cornering introverts. After Only Fools and Horses ended, Lyndhurst could never escape Rodney's shadow. Casting directors hesitated. He was too recognizable. Every interview circled back to Del Boy. And while he respected the legacy, it also haunted him. The very role that gave him immortality quietly took away his anonymity. In later years, life would test him in ways the show never could. The tragic loss of his teenage son Archie in 2020 shook him to his core. The nation that had grown up watching him grieve for fictional family now grieved for him. In that moment, the line between actor and audience vanished completely. We weren't watching Rodney anymore, we were mourning Nicholas. Maybe that's why the reruns hit harder now, because behind every laugh there's a flicker of melancholy. Rodney represented all of us who wanted to do right but kept tripping over life's absurdities. Lyndhurst gave that clumsy hope a face, honest, flawed, unforgettable. Today, Nicholas Lyndhurst lives mostly away from the spotlight, appearing rarely but always respectfully received, a symbol of authenticity in an era addicted to noise. When we see him now, grayer, wiser, quieter, we see not just the plonker, but the proof that gentleness can outlast glamour. And yet, as the brothers aged and the laughter softened, another figure emerged, the show's most unexpectedly beloved fool. A man so simple, he made simplicity into genius. Sometimes the simplest characters leave the deepest mark. In Only Fools and Horses, surrounded by the quick-talking Dell, the anxious Rodney, and the chaos of Peckham life, there stood one man who never seemed to understand what was going on, and somehow that made him unforgettable. His name was Trigger, and the man who played him, Roger Lloyd-Pack, turned confusion into comedy gold and silence into something close to poetry. He was meant to be a background gag, but became a cultural monument. Trigger was slow, literal, hilariously oblivious. He called Rodney Dave for over 2 decades without once being corrected successfully. It was a running joke, yes, but also something oddly profound. Because beneath that thick accent and blank stare, Roger Lloyd-Pack managed to capture the innocence we all lose somewhere along the way. Trigger wasn't stupid, he was pure. In a world obsessed with being clever, he was untouched by pretension. Roger Lloyd-Pack was nothing like his character. Trained at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, he came from a family steeped in art and politics. Off-screen, he quoted Shakespeare, discussed literature, and stood passionately against social injustice. His voice, calm and thoughtful, had none of Trigger's slow drawl. Yet, when cameras rolled, he became someone else entirely. He used stillness as his weapon. Long pauses, awkward nods, and the kind of facial expressions that said more than words ever could. Directors said his comedic rhythm was so precise it felt like music. Every time he appeared, the room changed temperature. Trigger was, in many ways, Only Fools and Horses' secret ingredient, the static background that made everyone else's chaos shine. He wasn't there to deliver punchlines. He was there to remind you that humanity's funniest moments often come from those who don't even realize they're funny. But behind the laughter was an artist quietly frustrated by how fame can shrink you. Roger Lloyd-Pack spent years in theater playing Chekhov and Ibsen, performing under candlelight for audiences of 50, and then he'd walk down the street and hear, "Oi, Trigger, say Dave." He didn't hate it, but it hurt. He once said in an interview, "Trigger will outlive me. I only hope he represents something kind." He was right. When Lloyd-Pack passed away from pancreatic cancer in 2014, tributes flooded from fans, actors, even politicians. Not for glamour, but for authenticity. People remembered how he made them feel, calm, warm, gently foolish in the best possible way. And maybe that's the secret behind Trigger's immortality. He reflected the quiet souls of the world, the ones who don't speak much, who get overlooked, who never quite keep up but somehow keep the room human. Watching him now feels like opening a time capsule from a simpler age, when humor didn't have to shout to be heard. Roger Lloyd-Pack never chased fame, yet it chased him to the end. And as the cast aged and fans aged with them, Trigger's steady gaze became a bridge between then and now, between laughter and longing. He may have called Rodney Dave for 22 years, but deep down the world called him something far greater, timeless. Every comedy needs its villain, the one who brings swagger, envy, and just enough arrogance to make the hero look human. In Only Fools and Horses, that role belonged to a man whose laugh could slice through a pub's chatter like a blade. Boycie, the used car salesman with the smooth talk and the sneer you couldn't forget. Played to perfection by John Challis, Boycie became the show's resident cynic, the man who had everything Del Boy wanted, and yet somehow nothing that truly mattered. He was meant to be hated, but he became one of the most loved rogues in television history. John Challis didn't play Boycie, he became him. With his deep, rolling laugh and perfectly measured smugness, he was the human embodiment of 1980s excess. Cigars, cars, and carefully ironed suits that screamed success even when it was borrowed. But what made Challis's performance genius was the vulnerability underneath the vanity. Boycie's ego was armor, and behind that armor lived fear. Fear of failure, fear of irrelevance, fear that he'd never really escape the same working-class world he pretended to look down upon. Off-screen, John Challis was nothing like his character. Soft-spoken, articulate, and warm, he carried himself with quiet pride. He loved books, gardens, and conversation. His colleagues often said he was the calmest man on set, never raising his voice, never breaking character, but always ready with a gentle joke that grounded the entire cast. Challis's chemistry with Sue Holderness, who played Marlene, was lightning in a bottle. Together they became one of British television's most recognizable couples, the flirtatious, sharp-tongued duo who bickered their way into cultural immortality. Their timing was flawless, their tension delicious. Every time Boycie said Marlene, the audience erupted, not because it was funny, but because it felt real. But behind the grin and the tailored jacket, life wasn't always kind to Chalice. He spent years struggling for work before Only Fools and Horses found him. Fame arrived late, but it arrived fast, and when the laughter faded after the show ended, the silence was deafening. Typecasting hit hard. Boycie was too iconic to escape. Casting agents couldn't see past the swagger, and for an actor who had range, restraint, and depth, that invisibility hurt more than rejection. Then came a second chance, the spin-off, The Green Grass. For many actors, such things fail, but for John, it was redemption. Boycie got his own stage, his own story, his own evolution. Audiences rediscovered him, not as a punchline, but as a man with layers. Chalice spent his later years touring theaters, meeting fans, writing memoirs, and embracing the legacy he once feared would trap him. When he passed away in 2021, tributes didn't just come from co-stars, they came from the millions who had grown up watching him. They spoke of warmth, humility, decency, words rarely used for a villain. Because that was John's final magic trick. He took a character built on arrogance and turned him into someone who, in the end, we admired. Today, when we hear that famous laugh, we don't roll our eyes, we smile. Because Boycie wasn't just the posh conman of Peckham, he was proof that even the proudest hearts are fragile underneath. And as the years went by, the laughter in the Nag's Head pub began to echo with memories. The older cast members faded one by one, and the faces that once filled the screen with mischief slowly disappeared. Long before Uncle Albert's sailor stories, and before Del Boy became a millionaire in that famous Christmas special, there was another figure sitting quietly in that cluttered Peckham flat, half asleep in his chair, cardigan draped over his shoulders, eyes tired but kind. He didn't say much, but when he did, it landed like truth wrapped in mischief. His name was Grandad, and the man behind him, Leonard Pierce, carried more soul than most stars ever could. He was the heartbeat of Only Fools and Horses, before the world even realized the show had one. When Only Fools and Horses debuted in 1981, it wasn't clear yet what kind of series it would become, but audiences immediately fell in love with Grandad, the retired docker who always looked slightly bewildered by the chaos around him. His humor wasn't loud, it was quiet, sly, often muttered under his breath. When Del Boy boasted or Rodney panicked, Grandad's deadpan interruptions grounded the madness in something beautifully human. Leonard Pierce didn't have the glittering resume of his co-stars. He was a seasoned stage actor, not a celebrity. He came from London theater, decades of character work, small roles, quiet dedication. He understood rhythm, timing, understatement, and when he stepped into that cluttered flat for the first time, he brought with him the authenticity of a man who had lived the world the show was trying to portray. But behind the laughter, Pierce carried frailty. Even as the show gained momentum, his health began to waver. The long filming hours were taxing, the physical strain relentless, yet no one on set expected what would happen next. In December 1984, right in the middle of shooting the fourth series, Leonard Pierce suddenly collapsed and died of a heart attack. The news stunned the entire cast. David Jason later said it was the hardest moment of his career because they hadn't just lost a co-star, they'd lost family. The studio fell silent. The laughter that once filled it turned into tears. They considered canceling the show altogether, but creator John Sullivan made a bold decision to write Grandad's death into the story. It became one of the first times British television openly dealt with grief, not as melodrama, but as truth. The funeral episode aired in early 1985. The emotions you saw on screen, Del's trembling, Rodney's broken composure, weren't acting, they were real. Every tear was a goodbye, and millions of viewers cried with them. That episode changed everything. Only Fools and Horses stopped being just a sitcom. It became a living story about family, loss, and love that outlives laughter. Grandad's absence gave the show new emotional weight, and in a strange, beautiful way, his death made the Trotters immortal. When you rewatch those early episodes now, the slow shuffle of Grandad's walk, his little sighs of exasperation, you can feel the warmth of someone who wasn't performing, but simply being. He represented every grandparent, every elder whose wisdom gets ignored until it's gone. Leonard Pierce left too soon, but his spirit never left that flat in Peckham. Even decades later, when the theme music plays and Del Boy yells for Rodney, you can almost hear Grandad in the background, muttering something under his breath, half complaint, half blessing. He may be gone from the screen, but he remains the show's invisible heartbeat. When Only Fools and Horses lost Leonard Pierce in 1984, it felt like the world had dimmed. The laughter was still there, but the warmth was gone. The BBC considered ending it altogether. After all, how could you replace Grandad, the quiet core of the Trotter family? The audience expected heartbreak, instead they got a miracle. His name was Buster Merrifield, and he was about to prove that sometimes life begins after 60. He wasn't supposed to fit in, he wasn't even supposed to work, and yet he became the lifeline that saved British television's most beloved family. When Buster first arrived on set, the cast didn't know what to expect. He had never been a TV actor before. In fact, he'd been a bank manager for most of his life, an ordinary man who loved amateur theater, boxing, and the discipline of hard work. Acting was his late-life passion project, not his career. But when he auditioned for the role of Uncle Albert, creator John Sullivan saw something rare: sincerity, the kind that can't be faked. Albert was introduced as Granddad's brother, a retired sailor with a beard full of stories and a heart full of mischief. From the very first "during the war" monologue, audiences knew he wasn't a replacement, he was rebirth. The chemistry between him, Del, and Rodney was instant. The trio evolved from a duo into a family again, and the show regained its rhythm. Off-screen, Buster Merryfield was just as disciplined as his character was free-spirited. He never smoked, never drank, and kept himself in extraordinary shape, even in his 70s. The cast often joked that he had more energy than all of them combined. David Jason once said, "Buster was the only man who could outwork Del Boy." But beneath that energy was deep humility. Buster never let success rewrite who he was. Even after Only Fools and Horses became a cultural juggernaut, he refused to act like a celebrity. He still took the bus to work, still sent thank you notes to crew members, still called acting a privilege I never thought I'd earn. And perhaps that humility is what made Uncle Albert timeless. He wasn't just comic relief, he was wisdom wrapped in foolishness. Every time he spoke about the war, it was funny on the surface, but beneath it was longing. For purpose, for recognition, for youth gone by. Audiences laughed at him, but they also saw their grandfathers, their uncles, their memories. In 1999, Buster passed away peacefully at the age of 78. When the news broke, it felt like losing the nation's uncle. Fans left flowers outside the BBC. Reruns played across the country. And once again, Only Fools and Horses reminded Britain that behind every punchline lives a person, behind every fool lives wisdom, and behind every goodbye lies gratitude. Uncle Albert's legacy wasn't about money, fame, or catchphrases. It was about endurance. The idea that no matter how late you start, there's always room for a new chapter. In a show obsessed with quick schemes and easy success, Buster's story whispered a quieter truth. The greatest triumphs come when you think your time is past. Today, when the reruns play, and Albert salutes the sky, that booming laugh still fills the room. He reminds us that comedy isn't about jokes, it's about people. Real, flawed, ordinary people trying to make the best of what life gives them. And that perhaps is the lasting genius of Only Fools and Horses. It began as a story about hustlers and dreamers, and ended as a story about family, faith, and the fragile beauty of time.